What is up, Nerf Nation? I'm Naptown Nerf, and today we are going to be doing a mod guide for the Nerf HAMMERSTORM. And I will be doing both upgrades to the internals and minimizing the blaster during this mod guide and seeing how simple that can be. This definitely does not need to be here. There's really very little purpose for this besides some cool sling points, a tactical rail, and some dart storage that really isn't that great to begin with. So curious also how this thing is performing better than the stock hammer shot. It is definitely getting about 10 FPS, at least higher than the stock hammer shot. So I'm not sure if it has a bigger plunger tube. It could. It's a larger blaster, obviously, may just have more draw, but we will crack this thing open and see what's going on inside. So let's flip it over and remove all these screws. So internally, this is looking very similar to the hammer shot. I believe this part that covers it is clear on the hammer shot. I think this is the same, or very close to it anyways. I'm sure screw ports are in a little different areas, and obviously this trigger looks a little different than the stock hammer shot, but overall looks the same. The plunger size looks the same to me. I'm pretty sure it's the exact same diameter and everything, but I do think the draw might be further because I know on the hammer shot there's a screw port here that keeps it from drawing back as far as it possibly could, and I've not done it yet, but I've always thought about possibly removing that screw port, but for structural purposes I never did it. But this one doesn't have it. It actually has a screw port though further down, which is good to keep it strong in this area, which is actually, you know, a very important part to have strength there. But we'll go ahead and prime this back. I'm curious how far this plunger head comes back. I'm not sure. It might go back further than a hammer shot, but it doesn't go its full length. So I think one mod we could do is possibly get this to actually prime back even further, possibly. We will have to see, but that's something that definitely would add performance if we can move this plunger head even further back in this plunger tube. But I'm not positive it's further back than the hammer shot, but it may be slightly. Maybe the seal is better. I don't know. But the performance I was actually pretty impressed with from this thing. Getting, you know, in the 70 FPS from this kind of a system is really good. And then we'll flip it over. Keep that screw. Looks to be the exact same size as all the others. And there are our screws. So I think it's actually reversed from the hammer shot. The hammer shot, I think, shows all this on the other side, which is interesting that they've flipped it around. But that will allow us to get in there and do stuff with our trigger and whatnot, and remove the whole mechanism out. So there we go. We want to make sure we don't lose this spring here. So this spring looks exactly like a hammer shot spring, so we should be able to use any sort of hammer shot upgrade spring to upgrade this. So that's awesome. This spring is pretty beefy. I don't know if it's harder than the stock hammer shot spring or not, but I think we can go a little bit better. I don't think I'm going to remove the AR or anything from this blaster, because to do that you have to do a lot of modifications. It is something that could be done though. I've done this before on my hammer shot mods. I've shown mod guys you can just fill in the dead space with hot glue and put some like brass or some sort of plastic tubing or something inside of there, so you still have airflow to the dart, but then the rest of the area needs to be filled in. It is a little bit complicated, but it's something that could be done, but I don't know if it's necessary, and I'm hoping to keep the AR in, so then dry firing isn't such a bad thing and whatnot. So we'll go ahead and take this guy out and see what we got going on in here. We may be able to make the seal a little bit better. All right, so this is the spring out of the HAMMERSTORM, and this is a stock hammer shot spring, and they are different. I believe this is a bit tougher than this one, but they are very, very similar. But this one I think has one more coil, if I'm not mistaken. This one has 11 and this one has 10, so they are a little bit different spring. I'm thinking that this is just a bit tougher than this one. They are pretty close. I wouldn't say it's a lot, and I wouldn't swear to it being tougher, but it does seem to me that this one is a little bit tougher than this one. But nevertheless, we will still put in a stronger spring. I do have an Orange ModWorks 8 kilogram spring, but I also have this kit, and I'm curious if this is the same. I'm not sure it's going to be because the screw ports are in a little different spot, but it may be. But I'm going to test that just for knowledge. And this one, I believe, has a 9-kilogram spring inside. So this is from Blaster Parts. I think every spring company makes a hammer shot spring, so there's lots to choose from. And we will see what we can do with this thing. All right, you guys, so I put this in here, and unfortunately the metal piece right here that is a little thicker than this one is going to run into that part. I think you could modify this to make it work, possibly, but I'm not 100% sure because I noticed also that this hole here is different than this hole, but I'm not sure that really matters. But it would take some modification to get this to work for sure, and I'm probably guessing the trigger might not work just because of the, obviously this probably being different, but it may. I really don't know. If somebody wants to play around with that, I'm guessing you could probably get it to work if you really wanted it to. Maybe in the future, if I really fall in love with this blaster, I may do a paint job and add these parts and try to modify it or something. But for right now, I think we're going to go back to the stock parts, which actually probably will give you a little bit better performance just because they're lighter. It just makes it, this prime is just a little bit harder when you add a tougher spring load, and sometimes you can get some bending and flexing, but I'm thinking it'll be just fine. So we will go ahead and undo what we just did, and then I'm going to probably put some electrical tape under the O-ring just to give us a little bit better seal, and then we'll pop in our orange ModWorks spring, and we will do some modifications to this shell. All right, so I just put about 1.5 loops of electrical tape on there. I didn't need a lot at all, and that seems to have a much better seal now. And I'm actually not going to even add lubricant to mine. You can if you want to, it just depends on how dry your plunger tube is. This actually has a ton of lubricant. I took it off the O-ring, but then when I put it back in there, it greased it up again nicely. So it has plenty of lubricant in there, so I don't really see a real need to replace that. But if you have a dry plunger tube, or you just want to change it out, just wipe out what you have in there already, and then use your lubricant, silicone grease of choice. So we're gonna reassemble this, but before we do, I want to point out that this is actually made a little bit differently than the hammer shot, or at least quality-wise it's made differently. Obviously it's reversed. I actually brought out a modified hammer shot of mine, but that's just these parts. Everything else is the same. Plunger tube looks to be exactly the same size. They have held it in a little differently, but the plastic they used on the hammer shot is way stronger and just a much tougher plastic than this. This is way flimsy and movable, and that makes it really annoying when putting it back together and putting your spring on. Usually I put my spring on last with this, but also when we put this one in here, this is way longer than this one, so you can't really just slip it on there. It's already down through here, so you need to put your spring on first, and then the posts that hold these in don't go in here very far, and then this being very flimsy makes it hard to hold it all in place. So it's a little bit difficult. We'll see if I can get it on camera, me putting this back together. So it definitely is made a little cheaper than the hammer shot. So that's something to be wary about, and I would be a little bit concerned adding too much spring load to this system, as it may bend and flex a little bit. It should be a little bit stronger when we add it into the main shell, but this one is very strong and is just fine to, prime and whatnot out of the shell. But this one, not so much. And then especially if you decide to use some sort of spacer or something, spacer with the stock spring probably be fine, but a spacer with like a upgraded spring may be a little too much for this system. I'm not sure. Just something to think about. But we're going to go ahead and install just an 8-kilogram orange ModWorks spring. Nothing too crazy. I'm not trying to get crazy FPS numbers out of this thing. Also, I did kind of look at trying to extend the draw on this thing, and because of the factors that I just mentioned, I don't think I'm going to be attempting that at this point. just to make sure we have a nice, good, functional mod at the end of this thing. It's not something I really want to incorporate into a mod guide anyways until I've done it and tested it. I do think it's possible, but I would want to do it first and test it for quite a while before recommending it to my viewers. So maybe I'll do that in the future. I know people have done it with the hammer shot in the past. I haven't ever done it because I've been worried about strength, but this I would even be more worried about strength. So anyways, we'll go ahead and put all the parts back in here, and then we'll start on minimizing the shell. So this torsion spring is going to go on like this, and then you want to get this piece put above that part and pushed all the way down. So it's kind of hard to show that and do this, especially when you have to do it with one hand, and this is probably the most difficult part, but hopefully we can do it without too much issue. And then we just have to get this, put back on that side, there we go, and then push it down. There we go, whoa. And then you want the nub of the trigger on this side of the tab, so it has some spring there. And then hopefully it's locked in its holes. Like I said, these don't really sit down very well. And then we'll try to get this guy on. Probably do it without the screws in, just for ease. So hard to hold in. Okay, and then hold it all together while you lock in the screws. Should be good. You can test this. I mean, it's not like you can't prime it when it's together, but that should be good. Looks good to me. So we can go ahead and throw this back in the blaster, and then we'll look into modifying the shell. So we're going to lock this piece into here, and you want to also, when you've reinstalled this, you want to make sure that this piece right here that has the spring on, make sure that hasn't fallen off, and this is behind this part. That's very important because that's actually what rotates your cylinder. So I think I'm going to minimize it this way, where I'm going to just trim off all this section here along this line. It's always good to pick a clean line to use, and that'll make it easier to minimize, obviously, and keep it looking nicer afterwards. Usually when you do this, you probably are going to want to paint the blaster. It's very difficult to do this and then make it look good afterwards. We will see how good it looks, how cleanly I can do it, especially not having access to a bandsaw. Using a Dremel makes it a little bit more difficult, but you kind of want to just Dremel a little bit away and then file down to do your fine tuning, which is what I recommend no matter how you decide to cut your blaster. It's always good to open up your blaster just to double check, triple check, make sure you're not cutting away anything important. So we will lose this screw port, but this one will still be here if we minimize this up here. So I think that'll be just fine. We will go ahead and remove the internals. Actually, it's just good to have them in there before you do any sort of minimization, because then you know what you need, what screw ports you need, and which ones you don't. That is pretty crucial. We will be losing some screw ports down below, so I'm not sure if I'm going to try to replace those when filling in the gaps that we will be leaving, because we won't really have any screw ports. Let's see here. Yeah, we won't have really any screw ports around this whole entire section. So that's one of the biggest issues. We will see how well that works once we cut it, but we can always replace that with like maybe this tactical rail to cover this gap or something like that, that give us maybe some screw ports. So you can always use some of that to actually cover in the gap. So I'm thinking about maybe taking this part and moving it up here. So we may even keep a tactical rail. That'd be kind of cool. So we'll see. We'll just have to see how it goes. Sometimes you just kind of have to dive in and then figure it out as you go. All right, so we got that all cut off. Looks pretty good. Filed it down so it was nice and smooth. Obviously that's going to leave scratches, but there's really no way around that. I mean, when you do some sort of modification like this, you're 99% of the time going to have to paint it to make it look really clean. But nevertheless, we will go ahead and fill in these areas now. I'm going to do that with a combination of this tactical rail that I stole from the bottom, and I think I'm actually going to flip it around and put it down here like this, because I think it looks a little bit better that way. But I'm going to also fill in all the gaps with a ABS sheet. You can do this with lots of different things. You can use it with polycarb, you could do a styrene, you could do it with ABS sheet. There's lots of different materials you can use. I just have this on hand. It's a good thickness and easy to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to measure actually all the gaps, and you could put it on the outside if you wanted to, or you can fill it in on the inside. And I think I'm going to go with the inside for all this part here, and then I'm going to actually do on top for this part because I'm going to actually, that'll help me bridge the gap between the thicknesses of that and this. This is a little thinner than this gap, so I think that'll help out, and then we can kind of use some sandpaper to kind of bridge that and make it look a little more seamless. I'm going to go inside here just because I don't want any more bulk than I need, and these are pretty straight lines, so, and it should hide a little bit better doing it on the inside than doing it on the outside, obviously. So we'll go ahead and we'll measure all these places with their calipers here. It's really nice to have calipers on hand, but that looks to be just a little bit over 15 millimeters. So I'll split that number in half, and then I will go ahead and use the factory edge, and it will be about a little less than 8 millimeters because it's got about 15 and a half. And then I like to take it here and just run it along here. And we actually need quite a bit of this at this thickness. I don't know how much exactly because we need it for both sides, obviously. But that will give us a nice thickness because that is actually the width. Basically from here all the way down to here is about the same width. So that should be good. And that will should do both sides, hopefully. And then we will also do the exact same thing. Take a measurement on the outside of this, split it in half and do it there. And then we will fill in these little areas like this little angle here, and then this little angle here, and then this angle here, obviously, but all the same process, just slightly different measurements there. So let's get started. All right, so I think I have those shaped nicely and I'm ready to lock them in. You just have to take your time and make sure everything lines up nicely. Make sure everything's flush and straight. So that looks pretty good. If there's a little bit of a gap in this angled part, you can fill that in with epoxy, no worries there. And I decided to make this all one piece. You could do it in two sections if you feel like that's easier for you. You just have to make sure, obviously, then it may be a little harder to make sure everything's flat, but you know, it shouldn't be too difficult, but either way is fine. But yeah, we have that set up nicely, so we'll go ahead and mix up some DevCon plastic welder 2-part epoxy. I'll put a link in the description to where you can get some of this. This is highly recommended to use for this application. Regular epoxy is not recommended. You want an epoxy with MMA. So DevCon makes a plastic welder, and then also Loctite makes a version, but I will link what you want in the description box, so follow that link and you will get the right stuff for sure. So we'll go ahead and crack open a new tube and get this thing going. All right, you guys, so this thing is really starting to come together. It looks really good. I'm really happy with it. We have that tactical rail locked in there now. I basically just eyeballed it to make sure it was straight, which was pretty easy to do so because the difference between the size or the thickness of this and the sheet that I shaved down with that diagonal there was basically the same, maybe just a slight bit different. And then any sort of little gaps I filled in with just 2-part epoxy that I had left over, and then I obviously sanded it down with a 120 and then 220 grit, and so that looks really good. One thing I will note is obviously I decided to set this in backwards, and I did that on purpose just because I thought it looked better. I thought the lines matched up because it was minimized better that way, but if you're going to use this functionally, that might not be the best idea. It just kind of depends on what attachments you want to put on here. The notch obviously is further back. You're going to slide things on this way, and a lot of attachments won't slide on that way. You can remove these 2 notches here so you can slide things on this way, but then they'll probably be too far back. Just something to think about. I don't use NERF in-strike rails hardly ever, especially lower ones. Maybe for a flashlight, and if I do, I have 3D printed ones that will work on there just fine. But something to think about when you're doing your own minimization or integration, how you want them to look, and then how they're going to be functionally after you do so. But this was a very crucial piece to add because I needed these 2 screw ports to hold this part of the shell together, because there's no screw ports except for this one right here and this one right here, which this is not locked into this. And I actually, speaking of that, minimized this, just cut out a notch right down there so it would sit right in there. That was pretty easy, but you could lock this part down and get 1 more screw port and make this a little bit more stable, but I wanted to keep it 2 separate pieces in case I want to paint this in the future, keep this part orange, paint the rest. Things to think about. That locks in there pretty well and is just as stable as before in my opinion, so that should be fine. Whole thing looks really good. Obviously, a paint job will be needed in the future, but for now, I think we're going to throw back in our internals and see how this thing is performing. All right, when you're putting this back together, do not forget that screw that goes in there, because that is important and will not allow this thing to rotate or the shell to close up correctly if you don't have that screw in there. So just a reminder, and just make sure that everything's working correctly before putting it all back together. So it looks good, so we'll go ahead and throw the other half of the shell back on, throw in all the screws, and we'll do a firing demo. All right, you guys, so our hammer shot is minimized. I threw a barrel attachment on there just to show you how stable it still is. It is, I mean, it's wobbly this way, but you know how in-strike attachments are. But it's still as stable as it was in stock form, in my opinion, so I just wanted to state that. I would recommend keeping this part separate from this shell, though, because you do need to have that separate to put your cylinder on and then to assemble the whole blaster. So we'll go ahead and put some shots over the chronograph. One mod I did not do that you can do is remove the barrel posts inside there. I don't know if you can see that or not, but there's barrel posts inside there that a lot of people remove those on hammer shot mods. I did not. I'm not sure it's super necessary, but it is something you could do. But we'll go ahead and see what kind of performance we're getting. I'm not expecting a huge boost in performance because we only added a little bit stronger spring. I'm not sure how strong the stock one is, but it did seem a tad bit stronger than the hammer shot stock spring, which is probably why we were getting better performance. But you go much over 8-9 kg and it becomes very hard to prime, especially with the stock hammer. So I didn't do so, and basically the only other mod I did was just increase the seal just a touch. I may experiment some more with this in the future, see if we can get more performance out of it, but for now, I think we'll be okay at this. So here we go. 74, 69, 68. So it looks like there's really no gain. 75, 78. All right, a little bit of gain, maybe 5 FPS. 66, that was low. 71. 76. So I would say maybe 5 FPS gain, not too much. Increasing the seal might have actually hurt it because it might have added more resistance. I didn't do it very much because of that, but I may remove that in the future to see if it's better without that. These are kind of things you have to play with. I may remove the post just to give a little less resistance, but a lot of internal mods could still be done to this. You could remove the air restrictor, and I kind of went into that earlier, but nevertheless, I think the minimization turned out really, really well, and that was the main focus of this video. So hopefully this helped you out a little bit and helped you get an idea of how that is possible and what it looks like when it is done. So thank you guys so much for watching. Please smash that like button. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. Ring the bell for notifications. And as always, peace out.